All stand, please. Please be seated.
Well, thanks, Mr. Armstrong. As you say, Mr. Bones' report is already in.
Yes.
It's in its entirety, and it's in for all purposes.
Yes.
It contains material such as, for example, Mr. Berry's
Yes.
record of interview with police and statutory declarations from witnesses who may or may not be called. So the position I'm going to take is, unless I'm persuaded otherwise, that I will treat as relevant all parts of Mr. Bones' report that go to his investigations and the conclusions drawn from those investigations and from the meteorological and other data that's set out in his report. But I won't regard any other part of the report as relevant unless Council draw my attention to it in their closing addresses.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Mr. Reid?
I'm content with that, Your Honour.
All right, thank you.
And as Your Honour's heard previously, the issue with the Berries and their reports, I think everybody agrees that the Berries were confused by the time they'd given their statements. The timing is out, and so for that reason, we're not going to be calling the Berries, I don't understand.
Yes, but in particular I had in mind the visit by Mr. Berry to the site, his confirmation of the area that he saw and the consistency concluded with the investigations made by Mr. Bones. So that's what I was saying, unless some part of it's relied upon. Of course, other parts are already in evidence, such as Ms. Barrett's records of interview and so on.
Yes, of course.
All right, Mr. Reid?
Yes, Your Honour, I did foreshadow a section 136 objection, which is effectively consistent with what I don't take Your Honour to have made a ruling with the approach Your Honour's taken. For example, Hutchins, I think Palmer, we're not going to hear from them, we're not going to hear from the Berries. For whatever reason, I'm not going to be taken as accepting that we're all agreed the Berries were confused. You're not going to hear from them. Their evidence, whatever's set out in there, can be of no weight.
Well, I've just preempted that by saying that I won't regard it as relevant. It's admitted, it's admissible, and it's admitted without objection, but I just won't regard it as relevant unless stress is placed upon it by either council in closing.
Yes, thank you, Your Honour.
All right, thanks. Well, we've kept Mr. Bones waiting long enough.
There was one last matter I needed to mention, Your Honour, which was that, Your Honour will recall with Mr. Walkley, I invited him to tell Your Honour whether there were any matters raised in Mr. Thomas's or Mr. Gilmore's reports that Mr. Walkley wanted to comment on. I would propose to do that as well with Mr. Bones, with Your Honour's leave, and perhaps we can deal with any objections to that when we get to that part.
Well, I imagine Mr. Reid might have a similar position in relation to experts that he calls and comments from them on expert evidence that's been received so far. So I think council are both in the same boat when it comes to things in the nature of reply submissions.
Yes. Thank you, Your Honour. Could I call, please, Mr. Barry Bones to the witness stand?
We'll sit through till lunch now, if that's convenient to council.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Bones. Come straight through.
Will you take an oath or choose to make an affirmation?
Affirmation, thank you.
Do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please say, I affirm. Thank you.
Just make yourself comfortable there, Mr. Bones.
Thank you, Armstrong. Mr. Bones, would you please state your full name for the court?
Barrett Charles Bones.
And your current professional address?
Tasmania Fire Service.
And is the Tasmania Fire Service located at the corner of Argyle and Melville Streets in Hobart?
That is correct.
Thank you. And what is your current position within the Tasmanian Fire Service?
Acting District Officer, Training Delivery South.
Thank you. Now, could you tell His Honour, please, how long you've been employed by the TFS?
In a professional capacity since 1995.
Right. And in what other capacity?
As a volunteer, beginning in 1986.
Thank you. Now, could you, could I trouble the operator, please, to bring up Mr. Bones's curriculum vitae, which is behind tab 29, but the relevant pages, which I seek to tender, are WTS.001.001.0011. And Mr. Bones, if we could just run through that document, could you confirm, please, for His Honour, that that is your current curriculum vitae?
I can confirm that.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Bones, you've also agreed to be bound by the Supreme Court Expert Witness Code of Conduct for the purposes of this proceeding. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, could I please trouble the operator next to bring up the fire scene investigation report, which appears behind tab 50 and is WTS.001.001.0156. Now, Mr. Bones, if we can scroll out and then just scroll down through that report, do you recognise that as a copy of the fire investigation report in respect of the vegetation fire attributed to 110 Inala Road in Fawcett on the 3rd of January 2013? think we're just into photographs now, Mr. Bones. So having glanced through the document that's been displayed on screen for you, do you recognise that as a copy of the fire scene investigation report that you prepared in or about January 2013?
Yes, I can confirm.
Now, Mr. Bones, have you had an opportunity to reread that fire investigation report recently?
Yes, I have.
Are there any corrections that you wish to make to it?
Don't believe so, no.
Thank you. Mr. Bones, does the fire investigation report that's just been displayed on screen for you accurately record the court process of investigation that you followed in respect of the investigation into the fire that is here described as having occurred at 110 Dunalley Road in Fawcett?
Yes, it does.
And does it accurately record the conclusions that you reached as a result of those investigations?
Yes.
Could I just trouble you briefly, Mr. Bones? Could you tell His Honour why it is that the vegetation fire that's described in this report is attributed to 110 Dunalley Road in Fawcett?
Yeah, I believe there was some confusion when the call first came in about the actual location of the fire. A lot of the time when we receive AAA calls, people aren't really aware of their location or what they're looking at, where they're looking from. So there's quite often some confusion about where brigades are responded to.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to ask you a couple of further questions, please, Mr. Bones. Firstly, the conclusion that's set out in your report is that the Fawcett bushfire, that's the subject of your report, was ignited as a result of a underground burn in a route extending from a tree stump that you describe in some detail in the report. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And in fact, if the court operator could please bring up internal page 33 to the report, which is court book page 0188. And if I could direct your attention to the last paragraph, Mr. Bones, it starts off with the sentence that on Friday the 28th of December, the occupiers had had a small campfire at the property. Then the second sentence, as a result of the campfire, there'd been slow smouldering combustion of the tree and the roots, and ultimately leading to the fire. Now, you refer there to a campfire on the 28th of December 2012. An issue has been raised in the course of this trial that there had been some burning off of vegetation rubbish on or around the tree stump in about September 2012. So not 28 December 2012, but rather sometime in September 2012. And the question has arisen as to whether the underground burning route might have been ignited and continued burning since the September bonfire rather than the 28 December campfire. Do you understand the proposition?
Yes, I do.
And could I ask you please to comment on, or tell His Honour, what is your view as to the likelihood that the burning route that you blame for the bushfire might have resulted from a bonfire in September rather than the campfire in December?
A few contributing factors in relation to that proposal. The fact that the bonfire was set in September. During that time of year, we sort of just come out of winter, so soil dryness index, that's a measurement that's made to detect the level of moisture in soil, measured on a scale from 1 to 200. Generally that's around the 50 mark or below at that time of year, indicating that the soils are quite damp. So that's one factor that that would influence the burning of roots underground, high level of moisture in the ground. And the other consideration here is the distance from the stump to the point of ignition, which we determined to be around 2.8 metres. Slow burning combustion would burn at a faster rate than the proposed timeline from September.
Thank you. Now, Your Honour, I'd like to now move to the question of Mr Bones's responses to Mr Gilmore's and Mr Thomas's reports, and I understand that Mr Bones has prepared some notes for that purpose. Mr Bones, do you have the notes with you in the witness box?
Yes, I do.
All right. Now, could we perhaps first start with Mr Thomas's report, and I'll ask the operator please to bring it up on screen. It is the first of them I think is document 19.
Are you hearing this for the first time?
I am, Your Honour. Look, I'd be content if I look at the notes so we don't run into the same problem we did yesterday.
Well, I can, subject to Mr Armstrong's views, that's one way. The other way is to give you time after Mr Bones has finished his evidence in chief before you're called on to cross-examine.
Well, I'd propose the first way, Your Honour, but if that's not acceptable, then I'll take the second.
All right. Well, Mr Armstrong, Mr Bones has the notes in the witness box with him, so they can be called for.
Yes,
do you have any
I understand.
difficulty?
I'm content with either course, Your Honour.
Yes, thanks. Are they typed up or handwritten, Mr Bones?
Typed up, Your Honour.
Yes, all right. Well, could my attendant please just pass them to Mr Reid so he can have a look at them, because he doesn't know what's coming yet, Mr Bones.
Yeah.
So, well, he may not know what's coming.
No, I don't know what's coming. These at least are notes. I'll need time at the end, Your Honour.
Yes, okay. Thank you. Well, that can be accommodated.
Thank you, Your Honour. Now, the court operator has brought up on screen, Mr Bones, Mr Thomas's first report, which in the court book is document 19. Could the operator please also bring up Mr Thomas's second report, which is document 20. And then Mr Thomas's third report, which is document 21. So, Mr Bones, can we work through your comments in response to Mr Thomas's 3 reports? And are you able to tell me firstly whether there's anything in Mr Thomas's first report that you wish to comment on?
Yes, there are.
All right, could we go back please to document 19 then? So, Mr Bones, you see on screen document 19, which is Mr Thomas's first report, and could you please tell His Honour what observations you wish to make in respect of this report?
I note from Mr Thomas's credentials that he has no experience or qualifications in bushfire fighting, bushfire behaviour, bushfire fighting tactics, or as a vegetation bushfire wildfire investigator. Therefore, his comments in respect to burn indicators, area of origin and so on valid. He first visited the scene in August 2013, some 7 months after the fire, and again on several other dates. So it puts into question what we call the micro indicators. So that's the burning of small vegetation, grass, leaves, etc., to determine the fire direction travel. During those periods of time, the scene was not secure, so people had access to the scene, which would destroy critical evidence. There's also been weather in relation to rain and wind, and that can greatly affect those micro indicators. Also regrowth, that's another problematic issue that we come into contact with when dealing with those sorts of things. Take your attention to report 1 also. Mr Thomas has stated that he used a trowel and a paintbrush to excavate around the tree roots. However, the attached photos 3.6 shows only a garden shovel. I'll question this type of excavation due to the evidence being quite small in relation to tree roots. They're very brittle, and having been excavating the ground myself at the time of our investigation took place, noting that the soil was very rocky and very dry, and it would be very easy to disturb evidence as you're uncovering it, as we're looking for charcoal roots, so they're very brittle and break away very easily. He also states that the entire stump was excavated and all the root structure was exposed. Photos 3.6 and 3.7. I'll question this, as no photograph shows the entire root structure being exposed. We only have a particular area that's been uncovered, so the whole entire structure wasn't uncovered. And also the heart roots of the tree grow down into the ground as well, so I'll question the comments that it's all been exposed. He commenced his physical examination of the subject stump actually at the stump, which is basically working from a possible area of ignition in an outward manner. This is contradictory of the standard fire investigation practice of working from areas further away from a possible area of ignition or origin towards the area of origin. By physical examining the fire scene in this way, he has possibly compromised any possible evidence that he may have destroyed during these excavation works. And to go back to the excavation of the stump, the only way that that could be fully excavated around would be by the use of heavy machinery. Once again, that would destroy fine evidence, and highly unlikely that that would come to a plausible determination if that was the case.
Could I just pause you there, Mr. Bones, since you've got these photographs up on screen? Could I trouble the court operator, Mr. Temploni, to also bring up your report, which was behind document 50. And could we go again to photograph 30 on court book page 0203 and display it next to the previous photographs? Now, could we enlarge the top photograph on the left-hand side and the bottom photograph on the right-hand side? And Mr. Bones, in the photograph on the left-hand side, it's there, yep, perfect, thank you. In the photograph on the left-hand side, Mr. Bones, there are two wooden trunks or roots, each of which appears to have been burned at its leftmost extremity. Do you see those?
Yes, I do.
Now, do you recall when you were in attendance at 242 White Hills Road conducting your investigation and involved in the excavation of the area around the tree stump, do you recall whether you ever saw any wooden structures
no,
in
I
the course
didn't.
of your investigation that resemble what you see in the photograph on the left-hand side?
No.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Can you please go on with your comments in response to Mr. Thomas's first report?
I'd like to move on to the second report at this point in time.
Thank you. So that's
okay.
document 20.
Please, could we move to 2.1.1? In relation to Mr. Thomas's response on my initial attendance at the fire scene, the burn indicators observed were, in my opinion, inconclusive to the extent that it was, and I'd like to reiterate the next points, Your Honour, not possible to determine an approximate area of fire origin, let alone a point of fire origin or an ignition source. I'd like to question Mr. Thomas's techniques there in relation to his qualifications in wildfire investigation, and his working from the stump outward clearly shows that he has no understanding of the process. Otherwise, he would have seen the macro indicators, the larger indicators on the trees away from the area of origin, moving back to the area of origin, which he does not explain, so he's unable to locate any particular sources. His response to 2.1.2, a cause or possible causes include deliberate ignition, hot embers, objects from previous fires, improperly discarded smoking materials, and magnification through glass. Any one of these potential heat sources could have caused the fire. I'd like to question there was no other considerations taken into place there as far as any other potential ignition sources, which is covered off in my report. Point 2.1.3, Thomas also states, the approach to fire investigation is to firstly gather all available information. At the point we investigated the fire, we had little or no information prior to our first examination of the scene, and we relied on the physical indicators, thus not having a biased opinion of the possible cause. So to point out a picture for you there, Your Honour, in relation to that, we attended the scene on the first day. The occupants were taken away by police at that point, and they had their reasons for doing that. We hadn't spoken to the first arriving firefighters at this stage because they were off at the head of the fire, extinguishing the fire, and our first initial assessments of the scene gave us two possible areas of ignition. Following the process of working from the outside, looking at the micro, smaller indicators and the macro, larger indicators to get us to two possible points or areas, of ignition. So we've made that.
One of which was then excluded.
One was, yes, exactly right. So in relation to us gathering information, initially I'd like to just point out it was an unbiased determination looking at the physical evidence that took us to those particular areas.
Can I just pause you there, please, Mr. Bones? That attendance that you've just described, that was on the 5th of January, is that correct?
That's correct.
And then you went back the next day on the 6th of January?
Correct.
So on the 5th of January, you've said we. Who was the we in that sentence?
Tony Johnson is a regional fire investigator from Launceston who I called in to assist with the investigation.
Thank you. And what were Mr. Johnson's qualifications as a wildfire investigator?
I'm unsure of his exact qualifications, but I know he at least had an internal Tasmania Fire Service investigation qualification for wildfire.
Thank you. And then on the 6th of January, when you attended 242 White Hills Road, which other fire service officers were you with on that occasion?
Steve Walkley. Looking at the severity of the fire in hand, I wanted to make sure that I had a team of people looking at the cause and origin of the fire. Steve Walkley is probably the most senior wildfire investigator in Tasmania at that point in time. So I engaged Mr. Walkley after the first walk around on the Saturday, to come on scene on Sunday and help process the scene, giving his experience in the field.
Thank you. Was there anybody else from the fire service with you on the Sunday, the 6th?
Tony Johnson.
Thank you. All right, please continue in relation to Mr. Thomas's report.
Uh, 2.1.3. Sorry, I've done that one. My apologies. 2.1.2. The cause or possible causes include deliberate ignition, hot embers from previous improperly discarded smoke materials and magnification through glass. So we expanded there in relation to his response from before, and I know of no evidence, pardon me, got the wrong reading here. 2.1.2. Excuse me, I'll just reference the wrong thing then. I want to go to the deliberate ignition comment, response.
That's there at 2.1.2 in the response.
Apologies.
A cause or possible causes include deliberate ignition.
Ignition, yes, sorry. This cannot be categorically excluded. However, I know of no evidence or information that would corroborate this possibility. There are no persons or persons around the area of ignition prior to the fire starting. So we have no reason to believe that is the case, but that was one of the things that was considered during the investigation. I know of no evidence or information that would suggest, in relation to, hot embers and objects from previous fires. I know of no evidence or information that would suggest this is a possible cause other than a smouldering root of the subject stump. That was the only previous fire that occurred on the property prior to the day of the fire ignition, with the exception to the fire that occurred there in September. I did consider other fires that have been burning in other properties prior to the ignition, and they were all eliminated as possible ignition sources through the process of elimination and the investigation phase. Improperly discarded smoking materials. I saw no evidence of smoking materials during scene examination other than some I would describe as fairly fresh cigarette butts, and there is a reference to some photos that were taken on the scene. I'm not quite sure if we want to discuss those photos now. Or...
Yes, we can bring them up. I think it was behind document 101, Your Honour, and I think it was document... It was photograph 0008. And Mr. Temponi, in 0008, could you go into the bottom left-hand quadrant to begin with? And so is that the photo you're referring to, Mr. Bones?
That's correct.
So thank you. What did you want to say?
I'd just like to explain to Your Honour, in relation to fires being caused by discarded cigarettes. It's one of those things that's been blamed on starting many fires across the world. Conditions have to be quite specific for a cigarette to set alight vegetation. As you can see in that photo there, the cigarette butt's actually sitting on unburnt vegetation. And you note that there's a white paper still intact on the end of the cigarette butt. So generally when cigarette butt catches something on fire, discarded cigarette, I should say, that will obviously ignite the substance around it and subsequently burn the paper off the end, and you normally end up with discoloration on the actual cigarette butt, like it's been fire affected. No one prior to the fire starting was in the vicinity of the stump. There was a question around the farrier that was on the property prior to the fire starting. His works were conducted at the other side of the property, and when he left the scene, he drove down a driveway that would have been, and I apologise for having no measurements, 30 to 40 metres away from where the fire was ignited. He's not sure if he had a cigarette or not, so he can't confirm or deny, but the evidence for me is the distance away from the fire Mr. Wrigley was when he exited the property, which is most likely the time he would have been smoking a cigarette. He didn't have one when he was doing the farrowing work of the horse, but that was quite a considerable distance away from the area of origin. And I'd just like to add also that discarded cigarettes, they need to be sitting in an orientation where the wind's coming across the face. To give you a comparison between the heat output of a match compared to a discarded cigarette butt, the discarded cigarette butt puts out about 5 watts of energy, and a match is 50. So it's considerably less heat output. The wind needs to be going across the face, and needs to be low humidity and high temperature. and the fuels that comes in contact with at that point in time need to be very fine, almost like steel wool orientation, to set fire to them.
Now, just to complete this photo, Mr. Bones, could Mr. Temponi take us across to the bottom right-hand side of the photograph? And there was a so just on the I think on the bottom right of what you can see on the screen, Mr. Bones, you see there's three stones together and then a little white thing just up from them. If the cursor could go across to the bottom left of the screen, sorry, bottom left quadrant. So that the cursor there, Mr. Bones, it's been suggested that that might be the end of a roll your own cigarette.
Correct.
Now, is there anything that you can discern from that photograph that you consider relevant to an assessment of whether that object might have been implicated in the ignition of the bushfire?
I certainly can. Your Honour, I'm a smoker myself. I've been a smoker for 21 years. I've smoked rollies and tailor-made cigarettes. I'm familiar with particularly a roll your own cigarette that a lot of the time, even while you're smoking it, it goes out. So the likelihood is even less of one of those setting fire to an external object when discarded. When I look at this photo, I also see the cigarette butt sitting on top of what I'll describe as coals from a campfire. So which would indicate to me that this cigarette butt's been discarded after the fire.
Thank you. Now, having dealt with the cigarettes, could you move on with Mr. Thomas's reports, please?
I'll just have a little conclusion here. Given the time from the fire until Thomas first fitted the scene, I noticed from his photos that the micro indicators would have been very difficult or impossible to examine. Due to grass and plant regrowth, rain and wind, that would also affect the scene. Also can see that the tree stump had been disturbed, so to what extent had the rest of the scene been disturbed? How could Thomas be 100% certain that the route he uncovered was the route we uncovered? His excavations seemed shallower than ours and the route. I didn't see any real answers in Mr. Thomas's report other than disagreeing with the findings that TFS made.
Thank you. Now, is there anything you want to say in relation to Mr. Thomas's third report?
No.
Now, could we move then, please, to Mr. Gilmore's report, which Your Honour will find behind tab 15. And there are actually two reports from Mr. Gilmore, Mr. Bones. There's the one that you've just seen behind tab 15, which is the long one.
Yeah, that's the one I'd like to refer to, please.
All right, sure. So what do you want to say in relation to this report, Mr. Bones?
I'll just have some dot points to refer to, as in Thomas's report. First, I'd like to start with Gilmore and Fabian Crowe first attended the scene in November 2018. So it was 5 years and 10 months after the fire. I described earlier in relation to the degradation of the evidence with the first report from Thomas. Given the time factor, it was even longer this time. Obviously, there'd be greater degradation of critical evidence. If we can take us to point 38, please.
So is that paragraph 38,
No.
page
Yep.
0244?
Correct. And this question is in relation to the adjacent property at 244 White Hill Road that had been burnt 3 months earlier as a result of an escape burn-off. We had brigades attend this fire and it was deemed to be out some months earlier. And I'd just like to comment on my comments before in relation to fire burning 3 months earlier, whereas the fire would have run at that time, the soil dryness index at that time would have made the ground damp. It had been confirmed out by firefighters and there was never any report of any fire from that fire subsequent to it being extinguished by the brigades.
Isn't Mr Gilmore's point
Yes.
though that there wouldn't have been sufficient available fuel because of that 4 October?
Correct.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to comment in relation to that is, if we go back to the fires last year that occurred in Sydney, there was evidence of fire burning through bushland and then a subsequent second fire coming through days later. So that's not always 100% substantiated. So I'd just like to make that point, particularly given the damage of the first fuel reduction burn. I'm not actually privy to the scorch and flame heights when that was out of control. But this fire that's come out at 242, if that had a good head of steam up when it reached that and it was a crowning fire, it still would have affected the canopy of the trees at 244, being my point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Page 14, there's a reference to a drought factor index.
Sorry, just before you go on, Mr Bones, the point that you just made to His Honour that if the fire coming out of 242 had been a crowning fire, then that would have crossed over into the property at 244. Having made that observation, what is its significance for your assessment as to where the fire had started?
In relation to that, the fire at 244 was more in an easterly direction, given the wind conditions at the time of the fire. It would have been virtually impossible going on the first people that first saw the fire and the brigades that arrived, that the fires come out of 244 White Hills Road.
All right. And does the fact that it was not crowning into 244 tell you anything about how intense the fire was as it left 242?
I can't actually comment on if it was crowning through there. I'm just saying it's a possibility. So we might have had some indicators there that there was a crown fire in that space, even though that there was a fire there only a couple of months earlier.
Right, thank you. Sorry I interrupted you, so please go on.
On page 14, there's a reference to drought factor index. There's quite a few comments there, but my point here is I use the drought factor index, which is predominantly used in effects in forest fire. And aside from the area of origin, the small grassed area, predominantly the fuel types and the terrain and topography there was forest. That's why I made that reference in my report.
Thank you.
There's also point 49. There are many other large fires that were occurring around Tasmania at this time, including the Richmond fire. I'm not quite sure why that comment was made and what the relevance that is to my report, considering that any fires in the vicinity that may have potentially caused the fire at 242 were discounted during the investigation process. Point 53. This is in relation to the temperature and wind conditions at 242. I expect that the temperature in the forested area will be cooler and the wind slightly stronger on exposed sites and lesser on the lee side of hills comparing to the recordings at the Hobart Airport. This is due to the fact that Fawcett is located on a higher ground and in an undulating landscape. I'd just like to question how that could be determined. Local wind conditions and patterns can vary greatly. I've been in many campaign fires, and you can even have a full change in direction from one hill to another hill, just depending on the layout of the land. So it's a bit of an interesting comment to make, considering what qualifications. Even fire modelling does not always capture local wind conditions accurately when we're trying to forecast the forward movement of a fire or predict where it's going to go. We have some complex programs that run after we input the data, and local hills, undulating terrain, sometimes makes that modelling inaccurate. So it's hard to say 100% exactly which way the wind would be blowing in different areas around 242. Point 59. Gilmore states, a fire in grass on this day would be wind driven, fast moving and its shape long and narrow. The length of the grass fire compared to a breadth would be expected to be in order of 5 to 6 times. I do agree with this comment to a degree. That's why the fire in its initial run was between the two driveways. It was a narrow patch of land, but I do note that the time between the fire started and was noticed by Barrett was potentially up to 15 minutes. So within that time, the fire would have progressed quite quickly in a narrow shape, but then it would have started to spread out laterally as well.
And Mr. Bones, just in that regard, you've referred to the fire running with the wind and also spreading out laterally. What would you have expected in those conditions in terms of any backing movement of the fire?
It all depends on the vegetation. Dry grass is readily available, so that burns fairly well, and leaf litter. And given the dryness on the day, it would have backed. But obviously the rate of spread is significantly lower than the forward-moving fire. But while there's available vegetation to burn, the fire will still back into the wind.
Thank you.
Point 77, please. Here, Gilmore talks about experience from recording information from witnesses that attend both firefighters and members of the public. They'll be drawn to the running head of the fire. When asked to recall where their extremities of the fire were at various times, people rarely recall movement, time and space of the entire scene with accuracy. That sometimes can be the case, and I do agree with that. However, there's a reference later in the report, I'm sorry I'm going to put that down. He's willing to accept the statement made by Lachlan Robinson, who is a child that resides at the property, when he came back from the property to say that the fire was burning in the area of the large log and the septic line. In relation to that, also the 7 Mile Beach crew that first arrived on the scene, they confirmed there was no fire burning behind the big log and the septic line, the 7 Mile Beach Brigade. They were not chasing the head of the fire. They were there to do property protection, and they spoke to us and indicated that there was no fire burning behind the big log and the septic line area on their arrival.
I object, Your Honour.
Yes, but I think I've already had the evidence.
Yes, Your Honour has had it, I think, several times.
Well, no, Your Honour. Your Honour's heard from Mr. Butler, who said, when cross-examined, that Adrian Cotton knows all about that.
Not sure that's right, with respect.
There would need to be some specificity from the witness as to who he spoke to at very least for this to be admissible in my submission.
Yes, just let me check. It was Mr. Butler, who I recorded as saying that there were no signs of fire between the fallen down log and the septic tank. He was from the 7 Mile Beach Brigade, you'll recall.
Yes, I do recall that, Your Honour. That may be enough to ground that evidence, yes.
Well, that's what I thought.
Then it's subject to what happened in cross-examination.
Of course.
But that's a different matter.
Which no doubt you will do. Thank you, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Your Honour. I think you were in the middle of an answer, Mr.
No, he certainly wasn't.
In that case, I've forgotten what the question was. You were responding to paragraph 77, Mr. Bones. You said that you had agreed in part with what Mr. Gilmore had written there. You then referred to to Lachlan Robinson, and you then said that you had spoken to someone from the 7 Mile Beach Brigade. So I think the objection was, can you recall who it was that you spoke to from the 7 Mile Brigade?
Anthony Butler, the brigade chief.
Puts that one to bed then, doesn't it?
I beg your pardon, Your
That
Honour.
puts that to bed, I think, then, doesn't
It
it?
does,
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Bones, could you continue with your response or your comments in respect of paragraph 77?
During that process, when they were there, they were in property protection. So what they were doing, they were monitoring the flanks and also the fire that was burning in the gully, because obviously that, I shouldn't say obviously, that had a potential to blow back up to 242 to the rear of the property and put the property at threat. And also believe there was water bombing going on in that area as well.
And so what's, in terms of your comment in response to paragraph 77, what's the significance of the fact that the 7 Mile Brigade were there in part to deal with property protection and the possibility of flanking fire?
That they weren't under enormous stress is what I'm...
Yes, that's right. They weren't under stress. They weren't focusing on the head of the fire. As stated in Gilmore, they comment there saying that people tend to rarely give false information because they're focusing on the head of the fire and where it's going, not where it's coming from. But in this case, as the brigade was at the scene, and there's also a comment from Anthony Butler in relation to the stump, which is also on my report.
Thank you.
Paragraph 81. The area south of the big log and south of the pile of dirt adjacent to the big log is not visible from the deck at Barrett's house, particularly from that part of the deck adjacent to the door into the house. This is where Barrett was positioned when she first saw the fire. Therefore, her statement describing the fire she saw does not exclude the possibility that the area between the big log and the septic line was already burnt. This may be the case that Barrett could not view those areas from her deck, but Barrett has moved off the deck to try and fight the fire. And then she has shown us when we attended the scene where she believed the fire was burning, at the time when she noticed it, and also spoke about its forward progress. Also, just like to reiterate the comments of the brigade that the fire was not burning in the area of the big log and the septic line.
Now, Mr. Bones, did you ever yourself examine the area between the big log and the septic line to try and assess, firstly, whether it had been burnt, and secondly, from which direction it had been burnt?
Yes, I did. I'd like to speak to that later on in my notes.
Certainly.
Actually, I've got some comments here now. The amount of damage to the vegetation and scorched the tree canopy and the direction of fire travel confirms the fire burnt down to the gully away from the area of ignition origin and back up the slope from the gully into the big log area.
Now, just before you move on there, Mr. Bones, can I get you to identify by reference to a photograph what areas you're referring to when you say that the fire burned down into the gully? Could we go to document 101 and photograph 0063? And perhaps Mr. Temponi could take a screenshot of this photograph and we might mark it as we go. Now, Mr. Bones, when you said a moment ago that the fire burned down into the gully, can you direct the court operator to put the cursor in a location on the photograph to indicate where you say the fire burned down into the gully?
Okay, if we keep going straight up, further up, to the right, around about that area there.
Okay, just pause there, and then if Mr. Temponi could then draw a line, and can you tell him where to go with the cursor to indicate?
And I can't guarantee that that's 100% accurate without standing on the ground, being in that place to look at those critical indicators.
But now could you...
But off memory, that was about around the area.
All right, and as I say, could you direct Mr. Temponi to move the cursor so that it draws a line to indicate the direction of fire travel?
If you see to the top of the photo, you can see the discoloration in the vegetation in the treetops. Mm-hmm. So if you sort of go on a 45-degree angle from that red dot up to, yeah, keep going, yeah, you can go higher, about there.
And can we draw a line, please?
Draw a line to there. And you see that's where the fire's gotten into the top of the trees. You can see by the discoloration of the tops of the trees.
All right, thank you.
The fire damage, and then the fire's obviously spread wider further, and you notice the green tops on the trees to the right of the red line. That's where the fire is burnt round, and then it's come back down the valley and then back up the hill towards the house.
Is that what you meant when you said and back up the slope?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right. Yeah.
Well, where can you indicate where that is? When you say back up the slope, do you mean
Yep.
up towards?
So it would have burnt down in around the side of the hill.
Yeah.
So you can see how it curves to the top left of the top right of the photo. You can see there's a valley down through there, and it curves. The fire would have backed down the hill and then progressed up on an angle back towards the house.
So again, let's draw a picture, please, Mr. Bones. Firstly, can Mr. Temponi put in a little arrow mark at where the cursor is at the moment to indicate the first direction of travel? So at the top right hand end.
Probably to explain that a little bit better, Your Honour, the fire to the right of that line would have been flanking fire, which is lower intensity.
Right-hand flank of
Right-hand flank of the fire, yes, that's correct.
And so, Mr. Temponi, could you put a little, arrow at the top? On your existing line, could you put the two diagonal marks to indicate an arrow? We'll turn that line into an arrow. That's it. Thank you. Now, next, Mr. Bones, from the tip of that arrow, if Mr. Temponi could put the cursor back at the tip of the arrow, could you now tell Mr. Temponi, and perhaps if we can draw the line as we go, so that it can curve, can you tell Mr. Temponi where you perceive the fire then swung around and came back down the gully, Mr. Bones?
Well, it would have, the flank would have moved around, just sort of into the gully.
So the two separate lines, really, because you've got a backing fire.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Well,
Or a flanking fire,
or a flanking
which
fire.
will be lower intensity because the wind was blowing from west to east.
Right. So if the flanking fire that came back up the slope is not necessarily a continuation of that arrow at all.
No. It's a side moving, and it follows the topography.
Well,
Being mindful that the...
Sorry to take over, Mr.
Sorry.
Would it be better to start back at the house where you say it came up the slope and then go backwards?
Oh, we could do that, yeah.
I don't mind.
Yeah.
I just want to get an idea of where it came back
Yeah,
up.
sort of a bit hard to coordinate what I'm trying to say in this position here.
Yeah.
So in other words, the fire will burn out in that shape. You can see the discoloration on the leaves, lower intensity on the flank. It burns down into the gully, and then it burns back up the slope.
So, in effect, perhaps, could we do this, Mr. Temponi? Could you put the cursor halfway along your arrow? Now, can we draw? And please tell me, Mr. Bones, if this is accurate or inaccurate. Mr. Temponi, could you draw a great big sweeping curve to the right, and then coming back through the trees up to the house? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's sort of...
No. Wrong way, Mr. Temponi. Curving down the page. There's a great big reverse C. Further across to the right, please.
Sorry, it's just hard to explain.
Yeah, let's just draw this line and then you can alter it.
Yeah.
A bit. Yeah.
So the fire, initially, because of the wind and the topography, is narrower at the start.
Yep.
But then as the fire progresses without any firefighting activity, then the flanks will swing around and they'll follow the topography. It would have raced up in the top right-hand corner and then it would have burnt down the slope across from the line and then burnt back up the slope towards the house. But the fire also progressed down through the valley, back against the wind. And then later that night or afternoon, it came back up and then back around the house, at the back of the house.
When there was a wind change.
There was a wind change, correct.
Right.
So,
Okay.
Mr. Temponi, could you, with that curved line that you started to draw, could you extend it out a bit more to the right and then, start back at the arrow and now draw at sort of 45 degrees down towards the right-hand corner and then curve it around back to the house.
Back towards the septic tank
Yes.
area.
Yeah, and then back up, that's right.
So that's a better,
That's a
better line, is it?
Yeah. in a sorts, but the fire would have continued to burn down the whole valley. And then as it progressed back down the valley, it would have come up the sides.
Yeah. So you're not saying this happened all at once, it happened over a period of time, and in particular after the wind change.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Can I just ask you, Mr. Bones, is the curved red line now sufficiently far down into the gully to address the phenomenon you've been describing?
Without actually being on scene, it's hard to anticipate the rates of spread. There's a few things that come into play there. Being on the least, it's a southerly facing slope, so the vegetation would have been a little bit damper on that side. The fuel orientation, quantity and size and type as well. I didn't actually venture right into the gully to determine those factors. So the rates of spread and obviously the wind was blowing against the fire at that point in time. So there are a few factors that come into play there, and having not been there at the time the fire occurred, it's hard for me to comment.
So, Mr. Bones, can I just put it this way? If we look in the very bottom right-hand corner of the photograph, we see some thick trees. If Mr. Temponi moves the cursor, that's it, those trees there.
Yes.
Now, can I just ask you to assume, Mr. Bones, that those trees are up the face or near the top of the gully that's behind the house?
Yeah, that's a fair assumption.
Now, if that assumption is correct, is our curved red line in the right place?
It's all over time. Obviously, that first one we've done there would have happened earlier because it's closer to where the fire initiated, but it would have been a continuum. As the wind changed, the fire moved back along the gully, and then as it got to a section, it'd burn up it. That's how fire works. Banking and then flanking, yeah. And then when it got to a reasonable slope, you'll see down in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a bit of discoloration to the treetops there. So we would have got a faster rate of spread. Every 10 degrees doubles the rate of spread of fire. I'm not familiar with the gradient there, not having been down in that area, but that can significantly alter the rate of spread of fire slope.
Mr. Temponi, could you mark those trees with an A? Thank you. And then, just at your convenience, Mr. Temponi, on the bottom left-hand side of the photograph, can you mark that as BB1? Just for identification. Thank you.
I suppose the point here I'd like to raise, Your Honour, is the fact that the fire was not burning in the area of the log and the septic line when firefighters first arrived from the 7 Mile Beach Brigade. That's probably the critical evidence here. The way the fire burned around would have varied from time to time, depending on wind and those other factors that I talked about before. But it was definitely not burning when 7 Mile Beach Brigade arrived.
Thank you. I'll tend to that photograph, Your Honour. So, Mr. Bones, could you then continue with your response to Mr. Gilmore?
Point 98, which sort of confirms my theory. Robert Mcmanus is a firefighter with the 7 Mile Beach Brigade and was in the first crew that worked on the fire at 242 White Hills Road. He states that they attended the house around 1440 hours on the 3rd of January. He describes the fire as to the south of the house in the gully between 50 to 70 metres away. That was...
Could you just pause for a second, Mr. Bones, while we get the paragraph 98 up on screen?
Apologies. It's a bit quick.
Got it now, thanks.
So that's confirming that the fire was actually in the gully and not in the septic line or the big log area. And there's also a reference there to Dryness, saying that the fire had already burnt past the house. I'm not quite sure, I didn't reference the spot of that. Apologies for that. But in relation to Dryness's comment, the fire had already burnt past the house. He was not in the area of the house long enough to determine where the fire had actually come from, as he was focusing on the property at 244, because that's where the head of the fire was. So his brief time with the landowner at 242, he obviously wasn't there long enough to determine where the fire had burnt and hadn't burnt, because he was focusing on getting to the head of the fire as soon as he could.
Mr. Temponi, could you take us please to paragraph 96, preceding page, and 95. Do you see that there, Mr. Bones? Is that the Dryness references that you...
Oh, that's correct.
Thank you. Go on, please.
Dot point 106. It's in relation to the photograph. I think the explanation of the photos underneath it. We talk about 2 plumes of smoke. There's a couple of things that could have caused this. Fire spotting in front of itself, so then we get another fire starting. There's an easy way to explain it, in front of the head fire. So that could give an indication that there may be 2 fires burning. It's actually very hard to see, it's not that definitive. And the other thing is the fire might have, because it's not an aerial photo, as from one side, it's hard to determine, but not being a 3D image, it can sort of throw you off the track a little bit to give you an idea that there might be 2 plumes when there's actually not 2 plumes there. The fire might be burning in one direction and hit some heavy vegetation, and that would give a reasonable column. And then it might be in a low area where the fire activity is low, and not giving much of an indication there. And then there might be another area that's also hit some dense vegetation. So I don't think that's an indication that we had 2 separate fires. I think that was the intent of the photo, to say that we had 2 separate fires. Should I disagree with? Point 121. It's in relation to being particularly cautious when trying to interpret the contents of photographs, because they're only 2-dimensional, and as a result, features and or factors that might otherwise be apparent to the experienced eye are not always readily seen in a photograph. However, I took particular note of the following 2 photographs. If we could scroll down to the next photo, please. And there it's explained that there's fire travel from west to east, and that's the area where behind the big log, as you can see in the top left-hand corner, and also the septic line. So this is one perspective. Once again, being a 2-dimensional image, you don't have the opportunity to move around in a 360 arc. So, whereas you might see some indicators here that have been highlighted in the photo, I'd just like to go to figure 20 and figure 5 and figure 20. So you can see there, the explained photo before shows the fire direction going from west to east. So this photo here is of the same area but from a different location. And you can notice the staining on the rock in the top left-hand corner there depicts fire travel coming from east to west. Also on the log up the back, and the stain on the rocks in the middle of the photo. And also I'd like to take your attention to the stick at the bottom, which indicates also it's heavily charred on the right-hand side, Your Honour, indicating that fires travelled from the east to west. And also figure 5.
Just before we leave this one, Mr. Bones, please, could you just explain what it is about the rocks that causes you to think that the fire, as it passed over this area, was coming from east to west?
Yeah, that's called staining. So it's the gases that come off smoke, fire when it burns the smoke. That stains, leaves a stain on rocks, and the stain is left on the side where the fire travels from its origin. In this case, it's in a run of what we call a run of fire, so the fire's got a reasonably good intensity, and it's burning quite well. You can see that by the amount of damage that's actually caused to all the vegetation in that area. Very little grass left, if any. Hot ash, which indicates that fires burn intensely, or white ash. And to explain the origin of fire a little bit better for you, when a fire starts, because it doesn't have the heat and intensity with it, we call that an area of confusion. You get mixed indicators. As the fire progresses, we call that a run, when it gets into shape and form and off it goes, and it's preheating all objects in front of it. So to me, that's a heavily damaged fire area, where an area of origin in a bushfire sense is generally an area that has the least amount of damage.
Could you just enlarge, Mr. Tempani, please, the centre of that photograph, just above the stick? Whoa, yeah, come back a bit. Yeah. Are there any signs of leaf freeze in that photograph?
I can't really see anything.
Okay.
There might be in the top right-hand corner there, that shrub there. Mm-hmm. So it's most likely been leaning away from the fire. Mm-hmm. As the fire's come up the hill, it's not very clear.
Thank you.
And you were going to go next?
To me, that'll be another indicator there, possibly. So I suppose my point there is, when we look at the photos from Gilmore before showing the same area, and his photos that he's chosen to comment on there, it's the same area, but it shows different directions of fire travel based on a two-dimensional image. So in relation to us being on scene, we can walk around the whole site and we can consider not just that area, but the areas before and after that area. So we've got a good sense of the whole picture. We're not focusing on one particular area in a two-dimensional way.
Thank you.
Mr. Bones, you were about to move to figure 20.
I think it was, that's the one we just discussed, isn't it? I think it was figure 7 I was after. Oh no, my apologies, must have been a typo.
You did say figure 20 a moment ago. Can we have a look at that and see whether it's...
Is that the one we just looked at?
No, that was figure 5.
Oh, apologies. Again. Also, if we look at this photo, that's another photo of the same area. And you can see the staining on the rock to the left, which is indicating fires coming from the bottom of the photo, which is the easterly direction. The timber burn out on the ground there. So, it's heavily charred on this side, but not on the other side, indicating that the fire did travel from east to west.
Get a better view of the staining on the rock there too, I think, in that photo. On the left-hand side of...
Yep. So in relation to the tree stumps as well, there's some factors there. There's obviously been a fairly intense fire burning there. It's burned for some time, I'd say, without a lot of intervention from anybody. So you notice that you get a lot of damage around everything. You would have had high fuel loads around those stumps, log of grass and so forth. So some of those burn patterns can be not that effective in relation to the actual travel of the fire because of the different vegetation, amount of vegetation there can give us false indicators. But it's like I said, the idea there was to paint a picture. We didn't do a full 360, but you sort of get the idea that to focus on one photo and one point of vantage doesn't really give you a good indication of fire travel. Move to figure 9, please. If there are no further questions.
None from me. Please move on, Mr. Gilmore.
Now, figure 9 here, and it shows fire travel from the area of the big log across to the area of origin. So fire did travel across the road there, which is mentioned in Gilmore's observations of this area. However, fire was not on the road prior to Gilmore arriving, but prior to 7 Mile Beach arriving. So that depicts the fire's come up the gully into that area just looked at. It's burned across the road and back into the area of origin. And this can also cause false indicators because the fire's already started in there. We've got an area of confusion, which is less burning to vegetation, and then we have a fire come across the road into the back side of it. And so they can give another false indicator of fire origin because you've got 2 lots of indicators going on there. And whereas some of that area would have been very unburnt from the initial ignition, the fire coming across the road into the back of it would give an opinion that the fire might have started in a different location. And I'll just also like to add to that. That's why it's important to determine where the fire was and was not burning when we're talking to witnesses, and in particular regards. I'd like to quote Fabian Crowe. I did my wildfire investigation course with him in 2016, nationally accredited course, and he was an instructor on that. He's a co-author of this document. Point 175. There's a comment. The comment is TFS investigators concluded that the fire damage to the old stump had not happened recently. That probably might not have been articulated as well as it could have done. That comment related to Barrett's statement when she said that they set the fire in the stump. They put it to the front of the stump, not to the back of the stump, and that's where the timber was all visible above the ground because they realised there was some hot weather coming. And the area where they set the fire was actually, she described it as a deep hole. So that was in the front of the of where the stump's located, below ground surface. And by having the fire at that end of it, it didn't cause any more fire damage to the still standing area of the stump. Dot point 182, please. So here's a reference to Colin Thomas's excavation. Roots or charcoal trails in the area between TFS excavation and the stump would have remained visible to Colin Thomas during his trowel and brush archaeological dig type excavation. This area had not been disturbed. This still took several hours. In relation to that, the only tool cited, I think I've already spoken on this, but I'd like to reiterate it. The only tool cited was a large shovel. I'm not quite sure of too many archaeologists that dig with big shovels to uncover fine evidence. I believe that would have destroyed evidence while that was happening.
Mr. Bones, can I ask you, given your involvement in the excavation as part of your investigations, what causes you to think that using a large shovel would destroy evidence?
Well, as we move along, given the type of dirt it was very difficult to deal with, being sort of rocky. I'd call it sort of dirty ground. It wasn't sort of dirt or anything like that. It was like sandy, horrible, rocky stuff. And we found that when we were digging along, you'd sort of, as you undug, well, as we undug, no such word, as we exposed some of the root and we moved forward, we found it difficult to maintain the shape and size of the root as we went. So as you went, you're sort of destroying the evidence as you go, if that makes sense. My apologies for that of young children, so we use funny words now and then.
Thank you.
Point 189. And stated that this appears to be an old stump area, which is depicted as an area of origin. Once again, relying on a two-dimensional image. Yeah, and there's also comments in relation to unburnt vegetation in this area, as I explained before, Your Honour. The area of confusion, fires burning with low intensity, and to use another term in fire investigation, the fire stooges around until it gains momentum. No reason to explain this. This was described to me by Fabian Crow during my investigation course as well. And he made particular attention of that, of unburnt vegetation in the area of confusion, which he said there's no real explanation for it. It picks up some things and it doesn't others. Point 202. Back to the cigarettes again. I think I've probably spoken enough on that,
Thank you.
Your Honour. Thank you.
You and Mr. Walkley, I think I'm informed about cigarettes.
Point 231 refers to glass refraction. This is a bit like the discarded cigarette butt issue, used as an excuse for a lot of fires that have started in the past. Lots of roadside fires have been attributed to both cigarettes and glass refraction, whereas that has started fires in the past. It's very highly unlikely for that to be the case. If I can use the example of a magnifying glass to burn items, I'm sure most people have tried that at one point in their life, and you note that you can't have the magnifying glass sitting on the ground because it doesn't have time to capture the light and then focus it into a point. Brown beer bottles, no chance of it happening. Clear ones, highly probable, but once again, if they're buried or sitting on the ground, highly unlikely. I'd nearly say impossible in my experience. Also, bottles with water are a possibility, but once again, nothing elevated. And to quote Fabian Crow again on my qualification course in 2016, in his experience, every time there's been a possibility of that happening, the actual glass item or the item refracting the sun's rays had to be elevated for those reasons, as explained with the magnifying glass. Also refer to point 236. This is in relation to an email that was, must have been in the file or something. I want to make a comment to glass contributing. We can rule this one out, and that's only occurred because it was discounted, as explained to you, Your Honour, just a moment ago.
Thank you.
Figure 25. This refers to an unknown burnt material. Obviously, people lived on this property, so in the area of origin, we did find random bits of rubbish and things like that, all discounted as possible ignition sources. There are a few other photos amongst Gilmore's, or our photos, I should say, that depict bits of rubbish, etc. but none of those would possibly have started the fire. Figure 2.6.
Figure 26, do you mean?
Figure. Apologies, yes. If you zoom into that one a little bit, predominantly down on the bottom, I think it's just referencing to there's some unburnt material there. And that's the photo we had up before with the cigarette butts as well. I'd just like to point out that our investigations found that the fire had burnt underground on the root, through root systems, but the dirt on top insulated the actual fire. So that's why there's no evidence of fire coming out of that space, and that was never part of our findings, that the fire came out of the actual stump itself. That's from roots burning underground, and obviously there's lots of charcoal there, and that would be from previous campfires. Point 240. This is in relation to the photo. As noted, several objects are visible in photo 49 taken by Bones on the 6th. Approximately 3 metres to the northwest of the identified origin are what appears to be a base of a bottle and 2 pieces of glass. Grass fire in this photo also indicates fire moving towards the identified origin rather than away from it. Once again, Your Honour, we're looking at a 2-dimensional image, and I've already mentioned before that the fire came up the gully across the road and into the area of origin. So we'd have all different types of indicators there. Most likely that pink line was drawn by Barrett, where she believed the fire started. That's not going to be 100% accurate in its location. And then the origin was to the left of the photo. And in that case, the fire's come across the road. It's probably burnt in all sorts of funny ways and shapes around that area, given false indicators of the original fire travel. And I do believe there was no firefighting in this area at all either. Figure 29. This is a photo taken by Gilmore from nearby the Berry property. And his statements are around the fact that Berry would not have been able to see the area of origin if it was in the area that we determined it was. But the photo is near Berry's property, not on Berry's property. So the view that Berry had could be quite different to the one in this photo.
All right, thank you. That might be a good place to stop for lunch then.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Mr. Bones, if you could make your notes available to my attendant, who can take a copy for Mr. Reid, so he can have a look at them over lunchtime.
Most certainly, Your Honour.
And I'll adjourn till 2:15.
Your Honour, just before you go,
Yes,
might
Mr. Reid.
I foreshadow that the late notice of all of this material probably means I won't be able to complete cross-examination of Mr. Bones today.
In other words, it means that you might wish to finish early this afternoon. So
We may have to, yes.
Yes. All right, thank you. We'll accommodate that in the circumstances. I'll adjourn.
All stand, please. Honourable Court now stands adjourned until 2:15.